The thing is, you have to understand, Carl. That's what I call the fog. It's not just weather, it's a presence. It has moods. Some mornings it's a thin, apologetic veil, barely there. Other days it's a thick, heavy blanket that swallows the entire city, muffling sound and light, making you feel like you're the last person on Earth. For a photographer, especially one like me who was barely scraping by, Carl was my muse, my subject, and, I hoped, my ticket out of instant ramen for dinner territory. My name is Alex. At the time, I was living in a shoebox apartment in the outer Richmond, where the rent was just slightly less than a king's ransom. I was a freelance photographer, which is a polite way of saying I was professionally broke. I'd shoot whatever came my way: corporate headshots, awkward engagement photos, product shots for artisanal soap companies. It paid the bills, mostly. But my passion, the thing that got me out of bed before the sun was even a rumor, was my personal project. I called it, The Faces of Carl. My goal was simple, or at least it sounded simple. I wanted to create a definitive photographic portrait of San Francisco's fog. Not just pretty pictures of the Golden Gate Bridge peeking out of the clouds, but the fog itself. Its textures, its movement, the way it interacted with the city's bones, the neon signs of a liquor store bleeding into a soft gray, the lonely silhouette of a cypress tree at Land's End, the empty streets looking like a movie set for some forgotten noir film. I documented the whole journey on a blog. It was part portfolio, part diary. I'd post a photo and then write about it. I'd get into the technical weeds, shutter speeds, ISO, the kind of lens I used to cut through the haze, but I'd also write about the feeling. The solitude, the profound, almost spiritual quiet that descends when the fog rolls in. I wasn't getting a ton of traffic, just a few dozen regulars, mostly other photo nerds and a few locals who seemed to appreciate the effort. It was a small community, but it was mine. It felt safe. The shot that started it all was from Twin Peaks. It's a classic spot, I know, but for a reason. I'd been trying for weeks to get a specific image, the very first moment the dawn light hits the Sutro Tower, piercing the thick layer of fog that often sits over the city below. It meant being there by 4:30 a.m., in the biting cold, with the wind whipping at your face. It meant a lot of waiting. That morning was perfect. The fog was a solid sea, glowing faintly from the city lights beneath it. The air was so still you could hear your own heartbeat. I set up my tripod, my fingers stiff and clumsy from the cold, and I waited. And waited. It's a meditative process, you know? Just you, the camera, and the world holding its breath. Then, it happened. A single, golden spear of light cut through the dark, hitting the top of the tower and turning the fog around it into this incredible, ethereal blaze. Click. I had it. I knew I had it. The feeling was electric. It was the kind of shot that makes all the cold and the debt and the doubt feel worth it. Back in my apartment, smelling of damp air and cheap coffee from my thermos, I loaded the photo onto my computer. The raw file was even better than I'd hoped. The detail was crisp, the light was perfect. I spent an hour just tweaking the colors, getting the contrast just right until it matched the image in my head. Then, I uploaded it to the blog. Under the photo, I wrote, "The Face of Carl, 017. First light at Twin Peaks, 5:48 a.m. f/11, 30-second exposure, ISO 100. Sometimes you spend hours in the cold and dark for nothing. And sometimes, for about 90 seconds, the universe gives you exactly what you were waiting for." For a moment there, it felt like the whole city was asleep under a blanket, and I was the only one awake to see it wake up. There's a special kind of peace in that. I hit publish and leaned back in my chair, feeling that familiar glow of satisfaction. I made some toast, answered a few emails about a mind-numbingly dull real estate shoot, and got on with my day. It was later that night, while I was microwaving my gourmet dinner of leftover chow mein, that I saw the email notification. A new comment on the blog. I figured it was one of my regulars, maybe Photo Dan, or SF Native Gal. I clicked the link. The comment was from a username I didn't recognize, fog_watcher79. It read, "Great shot from Twin Peaks. I was there too, saw you wrestling with that tripod at dawn." I stopped chewing. I read it again. A little smile spread across my face. It was one thing to get a compliment on the photo, but it was another thing entirely to have someone who was there acknowledge it. Someone else who got it. Someone else who was crazy enough to be up on a freezing hill before sunrise just to watch the fog. It felt like a secret handshake, a small bit of validation from a fellow traveler. I didn't feel a single drop of fear. Why would I? It's San Francisco. The city is full of people who are passionate about its weird little quirks. Fog watching is practically a local sport. I just figured this guy was another enthusiast. I felt a little buzz of connection. I quickly typed out a reply, my fingers still a bit greasy from the takeout. At fog_watcher79 hey, thanks. Glad someone else appreciates an early, foggy morning. It's the best time, right? Small world. I sent it off and didn't think about it again. I finished my dinner, watched some dumb show on Netflix, and went to bed, dreaming of my next shot. The project was gaining momentum. I felt like I was onto something. A few days later, my assignment was to capture the fog rolling through the eucalyptus groves in the Presidio. It's a different kind of fog there. It gets tangled in the trees, creating these incredible God rays when the sun tries to break through. It's also quieter, more isolated. The tourist buses don't really go there. You get a few dog walkers, a few joggers, but for the most part, you're alone with the sound of the wind in the tall, peeling trees and the distant moan of a foghorn out on the bay. I found a perfect spot off a little used trail, a place where the path curved and the trees framed a clearing that was just filled with this thick, soupy mist. I was wearing my favorite jacket, a dark blue canvas thing that was warm and had a million pockets for my gear. I remember thinking it was probably a bit too conspicuous for nature photography, but it was practical. I spent about 2 hours there, just moving around the clearing, trying different angles, waiting for the light to shift. The whole time, I didn't see another soul. Complete and total solitude. It was perfect. That evening, feeling exhausted but happy, I posted one of the new photos. This one was moodier, darker than the Twin Peaks shot. It was all about atmosphere. The towering, ghost-like trunks of the eucalyptus trees disappearing into a wall of gray. I was really proud of it. I wrote a shorter caption this time, just some technical details and a note about the almost supernatural silence of the grove. I published the post and went to take a shower. I was only in there for maybe 10 minutes. When I came out, my computer chimed with a new notification. Another comment. It was him, fog_watcher79. The message wasn't long, it was only one sentence. But as I stood there, water dripping from my hair onto the worn wooden floor of my apartment, a cold feeling, completely unrelated to the damp, began to creep up my spine. The comment said, "Dark blue jacket today, Alex? Good choice, pops against the gray." I stood there, a towel around my waist, water dripping onto the floorboards, just staring at the screen. Dark blue jacket today, Alex? Good choice, pops against the gray. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Cold, factual, the casualness of it was what got me. It wasn't threatening, not on the surface. It was intimate, too intimate. My first thought, the one my brain desperately tried to cling to, was coincidence. The Presidio's a big place, but not that big. Maybe he was a jogger. Maybe he saw me from a distance, recognized me from my blog photo, and just thought he was being friendly. It was plausible, barely. I wrote back a simple, haha, thanks. Gotta stay warm out there. I tried to make it sound breezy, unconcerned. But I wasn't. For the first time, the project felt tainted. The feeling of solitude I chased, the quiet peace of being alone with the fog, was suddenly a lie. Was I ever really alone? The next week was a strange one. I had a couple of corporate gigs, shooting headshots for some tech startup downtown. It was mindless work, but it paid well, and honestly, it was a relief. No fog, no isolated clearings, just bright, artificial lights and people who wanted to look friendly and competent for their company's About Us page. But the feeling lingered, a low-grade hum of anxiety in the back of my skull. Every time I got an email notification, my stomach would tighten. 2 more posts went up on the blog that week. One from Land's End, capturing the skeletal remains of the Sutro Baths being swallowed by a thick afternoon mist. The other was from Fort Funston, a bleak, windy place where the fog comes straight off the ocean like a wall of ice. It's popular with dog walkers and hang gliders, but on a Tuesday morning, it can feel like the edge of the world. I remember being extra careful that day. I parked in the main lot, stayed on the main trail. I kept looking over my shoulder. I felt foolish, like a kid who'd watched too many scary movies. I saw a few people with their dogs, a couple of other hikers in the distance. Nothing out of the ordinary. The comments came, as I knew they would, on the Land's End post. Careful near those old foundations. The ground can be unstable. You almost dropped your spare battery pack when you were climbing over that collapsed wall. I froze. I'd been switching batteries, fumbling with my cold fingers, and the spare one, a small black rectangle, had slipped and almost tumbled into a dark, watery pit. I'd caught it at the last second, my heart lurching. No one could have seen that. It was a tiny, insignificant moment. I was tucked away behind a slab of concrete, shielded from the main path. I was sure of it. On the Fort Funston post, the wind was brutal today. Sounded like your tripod almost took a spill once or twice. Good thing you had it weighed down with your bag. My blood went cold. This was different. This wasn't just my clothes or my location. This was my process, my technique. Every landscape photographer knows that trick. You hang your heavy camera bag from the center column of your tripod to add stability in high winds. It's a standard move, but it's also something you'd only notice if you were watching me. Watching me closely. For a long time, my attempts to rationalize were failing. This wasn't a fellow fog enthusiast. This wasn't a friendly local. My blog, my small, safe corner of the internet, had become a two-way mirror. I was putting my art out into the world, and someone was looking right back through it, at me. The joy was gone, completely. Now, whenever I went out to shoot, I wasn't looking for the perfect composition anymore. I was scanning the trees. I was watching the other cars in the parking lot. I was listening for footsteps that weren't my own. The muse had become a menace. Carl was no longer a comforting presence, it was a curtain for someone to hide behind. I stopped posting for a few days. I couldn't bring myself to. I'd sit in front of my computer, looking at the photos, and I wouldn't see the light or the texture. I'd just see the emptiness. And I'd wonder who was in it. The question gnawed at me, kept me up at night. Who are you? How are you seeing this? It was a low, simmering paranoia that made my small apartment feel even smaller. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore, it was just an absence of noise that my brain rushed to fill with frightening possibilities. And that's when the idea came. It wasn't a flash of brilliance. It was a sick, creeping dread that turned into a grim necessity. My photos. He was seeing me in the real world, but he was communicating through the photos. What if I had seen him, too, without even knowing it? My hands were shaking. I opened a fresh bottle of beer, but I didn't drink it. I just needed something cold and solid to hold onto. I opened up my editing software, my heart pounding a dull, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The screen glowed in the dark Kanto. I didn't go to the published JPEGs on the blog. I went to the source. The raw files. For those who don't know, a raw file is the digital equivalent of a film negative. It contains all the data the camera sensor captured, uncompressed. It's massive, full of detail that gets lost in a standard image file. If there was anything to see, it would be in there. I started with the Presidio shot, the one with the blue jacket. The image loaded on my screen, moody and beautiful, the eucalyptus trees like pale ghosts. But I wasn't looking at the trees. My eyes were scanning the edges, the deep pools of shadow, the thickest parts of the fog. I moved the cursor to a dense patch of gray in the upper left corner, far behind the main subject trees. I clicked. The zoom slider appeared. I pushed it. 100%. The image blew up, dissolving into pixels. Nothing. Just grainy fog. I could feel a small, foolish wave of relief. Maybe I was just losing my mind. But the feeling wouldn't let go. I zoomed back out. I tried a different spot. A dark area between two distant trunks on the right side of the frame. It was a part of the photo I'd never paid any attention to. It was supposed to be empty space. I zoomed in again, 100%, 200%, the pixels got bigger, blockier. I held my breath, leaning so close to the screen that I could feel the static on my face. And then I saw it. It wasn't much. It was almost nothing, a shape, vague, indistinct, a few pixels clustered together that were just slightly darker than the ones around them. It was a vertical smear against the horizontal grain of the fog. It could have been anything. A branch, a trick of the light. A smudge on the lens. But it had a form. A faint suggestion of a head and shoulders. A silhouette. It was standing perfectly still. And it was facing me. A tremor went through my body. I felt sick. No, I whispered to the empty room. No way. My hands moved on their own, finding the keyboard shortcuts almost from muscle memory. I went to the Develop module. I grabbed the dehaze slider, a tool designed to cut through atmospheric haze, and I cranked it all the way to the right. The whole image became harsh and overly contrasty, but the fog in that corner receded, just a little. The shape became clearer. It wasn't a branch. It was a person, tiny in the frame, hundreds of yards away, but undeniably a person. Standing there, watching me, my breath hitched. I felt a primal, animal fear kick in. I frantically closed the file and pulled up another one. The Twin Peaks shot. The beautiful one, the one that had started it all. My first communication with Fog_Watcher 79. The sea of fog underneath the Sutro Tower. The incredible light. I ignored it all. My eyes darted across the frame, scanning the opposite hill, the dark, unlit parts of the peak I was standing on. I found a patch of deep shadow near a rocky outcrop, far to the left. Zoom, 200%, 300%. My mouse was shaking, the cursor jittering on the screen. There, the same shape, different location, different time of day, but the same posture. Still, attentive, a dark figure, half swallowed by the pre-dawn gloom, looking directly at my camera. In my moment of triumph, my moment of profound, solitary peace, I hadn't been alone. He was there, he was in the picture. I was gasping for air now, a choked, wheezing sound. My project, my gallery of Carl's faces. It wasn't a portfolio, it was a logbook of my own surveillance. He wasn't just commenting on the blog, he was in the photos themselves. A ghost in the machine, a dark watermark on my art and on my life. One more, I had to be sure. The Fort Funston shot. I pulled it up, my mind numb with horror. I didn't even have to hunt for it this time. I knew where to look. Not at the windswept cliffs, but in the background, near a cluster of cypress trees on a distant ridge. A place I hadn't even registered when I took the shot. Zoom, dehaze, shadows up. He was there, a silent sentinel in the gray. My camera, my expensive, high-resolution camera, had been a perfect witness, and I had been completely blind. The images I was so proud of were evidence. The whole time, I thought I was the one doing the watching. I was wrong. I was the subject. I shoved my chair back so hard it scraped across the wood floor with a screech. I stumbled back, away from the glowing screen, my heart hammering like it was trying to break out of my chest. The photos on the screen weren't beautiful anymore. They were terrifying. They were records of my own stalking. Each one was a trophy he had let me take. My apartment, my only safe space, suddenly felt like a glass cage. The big window that faced the street, the one I usually kept open to the city lights, felt like an eye of vulnerability. I lurched towards it, my hands fumbling for the cord to the blinds. I needed to shut it. I needed to shut the world out. As my hand closed around the plastic pole, my eyes darted across the street. It was late. The street was mostly empty, slick with a fine mist under the orange glow of a streetlight. A car passed, and then, for just a fraction of a second, I saw it. Movement, a figure standing in the darkened doorway of the laundromat opposite my building. A silhouette. As my eyes locked on, the figure stepped back, melting into the deeper shadow of the doorway, disappearing completely. I couldn't be sure. It could have been anyone. It could have been nothing at all, just my frayed nerves projecting my fear onto the empty street. But the timing was too perfect. I yanked the cord. The blinds clattered shut, plunging my room into darkness, leaving me alone with the terrifying glow of the computer screen, and the suffocating certainty that the thing in the fog wasn't just out on the hills anymore. It was here. It knew where I lived. Sleep didn't come that night. It couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the glowing screen, the dehaze slider pushed to its limit, and that dark, vertical smear in the fog. The figure. I kept replaying that last moment, yanking the blinds shut, the glimpse of a silhouette in the laundromat doorway. Was it real, or was my mind just taking the fear I felt and painting it onto the world outside my window? I didn't know which was worse. The idea that he was out there, watching me in real time, or the idea that I was officially losing my grip, becoming one of those paranoid people you see muttering to themselves on the street. My apartment had shrunk. The walls felt like they were breathing in and out. The ceiling seemed lower. It wasn't my sanctuary anymore. It was a cage I'd locked myself in. I spent the night on the couch, a heavy maglite in my hand, listening. Listening for the creak of the floorboards in the hallway, the jiggle of the doorknob, the soft scrape of a foot on the fire escape outside my kitchen window. I heard nothing but the normal night sounds of the city, a distant siren, the hum of the old refrigerator, the groan of the building's pipes. But in my head, every sound was a potential footstep. My own home had become a haunted house, and the ghost was a man I'd never met but who knew the brand of my jacket. The next few days were a blur of exhaustion and low-level terror. I tried to work. I had a deadline for an architectural magazine, photos of a new, minimalist library in Oakland. But I couldn't focus. The images I took were flat, lifeless. All I saw were the empty spaces, the dark corners. I kept expecting to zoom in and find him there, standing behind a bookshelf or reflected in the glass. My passion, the one thing that had always been my escape, was now the source of the poison. I got an email from an editor at a prestigious photography journal. A woman named Sarah Chen. She'd been following my blog, The Faces of Carl, for months. She loved it. She wrote, "Your work captures something essential about San Francisco, Alex. It's not just fog, it's the city's soul. We're putting together a feature on emerging landscape artists, and we'd be honored to include you." A few weeks ago, this email would have been a dream come true. It would have meant rent paid, validation, a future. I would have called my sister, maybe even splurged on a decent bottle of scotch. Now, reading it, I just felt a cold, hollow ache. The project was dead. It had been murdered. How could I explain that to her? I sat there for an hour, staring at the blank reply screen. I tried to write something professional, something normal. My fingers felt like lead. "Hi Sarah, thanks so much for reaching out. I'm a big admirer of your journal. I am, of course, very interested." I stopped. The words felt like a lie. I wasn't just interested, I was desperate. But I also felt like a fraud. What could I send her? A collection of photos that were secretly a stalker's scrapbook? I continued, the words coming out strained. "The project has been challenging lately. To be honest, the solitude required to get these shots is becoming difficult. I feel like I'm being watched out there. It's affecting my ability to work, to find the right headspace. It's probably nothing, just a weird feeling, but it's hard to shake." I hit send before I could second guess myself. It was a mistake, I knew it. It sounded unprofessional, maybe even unstable, but it was the truth, or at least a sliver of it. The act of typing it out, of admitting it to someone else, made it feel more real and, somehow, even more terrifying. For 2 days, I didn't leave the apartment except to get milk. I let my camera bag sit by the door, collecting dust. The thought of picking it up made my stomach clench. He was winning. This faceless, nameless shadow was grounding me, stripping me of my identity piece by piece. I was a photographer who was afraid of his camera, a chaser of fog who was terrified of going outside, and that's what finally broke me. It was a cold, gray Thursday morning. The fog was thick, pressing against my windows like a blindfold. And a wave of anger, hot and sharp, cut through the fear. I wasn't going to let him win. I wasn't going to let some creep turn me into a prisoner in my own life. This project was mine. The fog was mine. I was going to take it back. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff. I grabbed my bag, my tripod. My hands were shaking, but I forced my fingers to work, checking batteries, packing lenses. I decided to go somewhere new, somewhere I'd never posted about. A small, rugged point of land south of the city, a place a friend had told me about once. It was a nasty hike to get out there, along a crumbling coastal trail that most people avoided. It was perfect. There would be no one there. No joggers, no tourists, just me, the cliff, and the sea. I could prove to myself that it was all in my head. The drive down Highway 1 was tense. Every car that stayed behind me for more than a minute felt like a threat. I kept checking my rearview mirror, my heart thumping in nervous rhythm. The trail was as deserted as I'd hoped. The only sound was the wind whistling past my ears and the distant, mournful bellow of a foghorn. The air was thick with the smell of salt and damp earth. I found my spot on a rocky promontory overlooking a churning gray ocean. The fog was so dense it was like being inside a cloud. You couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. It was beautiful. For a minute, a single minute, the old feeling came back. The peace, the thrill of creation. I set up the tripod, carefully leveling it on the uneven ground. I mounted the camera and composed my shot, a jagged rock formation jutting out of the invisible surf below, its shape barely suggested through the mist. It was a good shot. A strong one. I clicked the shutter once, twice. Then I realized the composition would be better with a wider lens. My bag was about 10 feet away, back where the trail was a little more stable. I looked around. Nothing. Just the gray void. The silence was absolute. I left the camera on the tripod and walked back to the bag. I knelt down, unzipped the main compartment, and fumbled for the lens case. The whole thing took maybe a minute. 90 seconds, tops. I found the lens, zipped the bag back up, and stood. When I turned back to the tripod, my throat closed up. Everything was exactly as I had left it. The camera, the tripod, the composition. But there was something new. Something that hadn't been there 90 seconds ago. There, pressed into the soft, damp earth right next to the front leg of my tripod, was a footprint. It wasn't mine. I was wearing hiking boots with a distinctive crosshatch pattern. This was a different tread. Deeper, the print of a heavy work boot with a clear, aggressive lug sole. It was fresh. The edges were sharp and clean. It hadn't been there when I set the tripod down. It couldn't have been. I would have seen it. My blood turned to ice. A single, silent message screamed through my mind. He was right here. Not 100 yards away in the mist. Not watching from a distant ridge. He had been standing close enough to touch my camera, while my back was turned, while I was kneeling, vulnerable, fumbling with a lens. The silence that had felt so peaceful moments before now felt heavy, deliberate, and full of menace. He was still here, watching me. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just stared at the print in the mud, this undeniable, physical violation of my space. My world narrowed to that single, muddy shape. I scanned the fog around me, my eyes wide with a primal, animal terror. The gray walls of mist weren't a canvas anymore. They were a curtain, and he was behind it. Panic, pure and undiluted, finally broke through the paralysis. I didn't think, I just acted. I scrambled forward, grabbed the tripod, camera and all, collapsing the legs as I ran. I didn't bother putting the lens away. I just half ran, half stumbled back down the trail, my lungs burning, my bag banging against my back. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a footstep behind me. I didn't look back. I was too afraid of what I might see. I made it to my car, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. I threw the gear in the back, slammed the door, and locked it. I peeled out of the dirt lot, tires spitting gravel, and didn't slow down until I was back on the main highway, surrounded by other cars, surrounded by the mundane safety of civilization. Back in my apartment, I triple-checked the locks on the door and the windows. I felt violated, hunted. The footprint had changed everything. This wasn't about a blog or photos anymore. The digital threat had crossed over. It was now made of flesh and blood and mud and malice. He hadn't hurt me. He hadn't even shown himself. He had just left a sign, a calling card. I can get this close whenever I want to. I sat in the dark for hours, the fear churning in my gut. I didn't even turn on my computer. I couldn't face it, but eventually the morbid curiosity, the need to know, became unbearable. With a sense of grim finality, I opened my laptop. I had a new notification on the blog. My stomach sank. It wasn't a public comment on a post. It was a private message. The first one he'd ever sent. It was from Fog_Watcher79. I clicked on it, my breath held tight in my chest. The message was just one sentence. You seem to be in a hurry today. You almost dropped your lens cap. Good thing I picked it up for you. My first coherent thought was about the lens cap. It was a stupid, mundane thought in the face of sheer terror, but my brain latched onto it like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. The message wasn't a threat. It was a statement, a proof of presence. I scrambled back from the laptop, my chair rolling into the wall with a dull thud. My camera bag was still on the floor by the door, a mess of straps and canvas where I dumped it after my panicked flight from the coast. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely work the zipper. I fumbled inside, my fingers pushing past the cold metal of spare lenses and battery packs. And there it was, tucked into its usual mesh pocket. The round, black plastic lens cap. He hadn't taken it. He had picked it up, or maybe just seen it on the ground, and then put it, where? Had he put it back in my bag while my back was turned? The idea was so obscene, so violating, that my stomach heaved. Or had he just left it on a rock for me to find, and then watched to see if I did? I didn't know which was worse. He could have been that close. Close enough to touch my things. Close enough to touch me. The project was over. I knew it in that instant. It wasn't my decision anymore. He had taken it from me. There would be no more chasing fog. No more pre-dawn hikes. The joy of it, the quiet solitude I had once craved, was now just a stage for my own personal horror show. I was done. The next few days were lived behind triple locked doors. I became a creature of my own apartment. I'd been a photographer, someone who lived in the expansive world outside, but now my entire world was a few hundred square feet of hardwood floors and plaster walls. The city outside my window, the city I loved and had dedicated myself to capturing, might as well have been on another planet. It was his territory now. I spent most of the time on my couch, laptop open but not for work. I was obsessively tracking online news, looking for any reports of attacks on hikers, any strange disappearances on the coastal trails. Anything that might give this faceless phantom a name or a motive. I found nothing. It was just me. He was just for me. The silence from Fog_Watcher79 was absolute. No more comments, no more messages. The blog was a dead space. That silence was a different kind of torture. It was the sound of a predator waiting. 2 days after the incident at the cliff, I couldn't stand it anymore. The need to know, to see, became an itch under my skin I couldn't scratch. It was a form of self-harm, I think. I needed to look at the wound. I took the memory card from the camera, my hands steady now with a kind of grim resolve, and slid it into my laptop. The files loaded, little thumbnails of gray, misty dread. I clicked open the first one, the wide shot of the rock formation. It was a good photo, technically. Well composed, perfectly exposed. But I saw none of that. My eyes scanned every pixel, every soft edge where fog met rock. I was looking for him. For that vertical smear in the mist, the shape that had haunted my sleep for weeks. I pushed the dehaze slider all the way to the right. The fog receded digitally, revealing the hard lines of the rocks, the churn of the water below. But there was no figure. Not in the mist, not on the rocks, not anywhere. I felt a second of relief so profound it almost made me dizzy. Maybe I had been wrong. Maybe the footprint was just a coincidence. A hiker who came and went so quietly I never heard him. Maybe Fog_Watcher79 was just some other photographer who saw my lens cap fall and was playing a sick joke. But I kept looking. I zoomed in, panning across the image. My spot on the promontory was framed by the crumbling remains of an old wooden guardrail. It was weathered, gray, and splintered, and as my eyes scanned along the top rail, I stopped. There was something there. It was small, a dark little shape sitting on the rail, maybe 10-15 feet from where my tripod stood. In the low light, high ISO chaos of the image, it was barely more than a smudge. But it wasn't a rock or a piece of wood debris. It had a distinct shape. I zoomed in further, the image dissolving into a mess of digital noise. I ran it through a sharpening filter, then another. The shape clarified. My breath hitched. It was a bird, a small bird, carved from a single piece of wood. It was crude, almost primitive. The wings were just suggested angles, the head a simple knob. But I could just make out a dark speck where an eye would be. It was facing the camera. It was facing me. I hadn't seen it. I had been so consumed by panic over the footprint that I hadn't noticed this thing. Placed there, deliberately, a little silent spectator to my terror. The footprint was a violation of my space. This was something else. This was a signature, an artist's mark left at the scene. I spent the rest of the day in a state of agitated paralysis. I'd close the laptop, telling myself to stop, to get a grip. Then, minutes later, I'd open it again, staring at that little wooden bird, that totem of my fear. The silence from him continued. No messages, no comments. It felt like he was letting the bird do the talking now. 3 more days passed. The city outside was drenched in a rare, brilliant sunshine, but it didn't reach me. I ordered food delivery, tipping the driver excessively through the app so I wouldn't have to open the door more than a crack to grab the bag. I let the phone ring when my sister called. What could I tell her? How could I explain that I was being hunted by a ghost who left little wooden trinkets for me? I sounded insane even to myself. Maybe I was. Maybe the stress had finally cracked something in my head. Maybe I'd imagined the bird in the photo. On the 4th morning, I ran out of milk. A simple, domestic problem. But it felt like a monumental crisis. It meant I had to go outside. Just to the corner store. I could do that. People do that every day. It's normal. I stood at my door for a full 5 minutes, my hand hovering over the deadbolt. I took a deep breath, like a diver about to go under. I told myself it was fine. The sun was out. The world was normal. He was a creature of the fog, of the lonely places. He didn't belong here, in the bright, busy city. I turned the lock. The bolt slid back with a heavy, final-sounding thud. I pulled the door inward. I was planning to just grab the newspaper from the floor in the hall. It was the first thing I saw. But then I saw something else. It was sitting directly in the center of my worn, gray doormat. Placed with perfect, intentional precision. A small, wooden bird. My world, which had already shrunk to the size of my apartment, now collapsed into a single point of absolute, mind-shattering horror. It was him. It was the bird from the photograph. The same crude, splintery pine. The same suggested wings. I could see the knife marks, the rough texture of the wood. It was cold, hard, and undeniably real. It wasn't a digital artifact. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was here. He had been here. He had stood on this very spot, outside my door. He had bent down and placed this thing, this trophy, this message, on my welcome mat. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped in my throat, a solid ball of ice. I remember reaching out, my hand trembling violently, and picking it up. It felt rough and light in my palm. I stared at it for a second that stretched into an eternity. This thing had been in his hand. Now it was in mine. Then the paralysis broke. I snatched the bird, slammed the door shut, and threw the deadbolt. I fumbled with the chain lock, my fingers feeling like fat, useless sausages, until it finally slid into place. I leaned my back against the door, sliding down to the floor, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to break out. I was breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. My home, my last safe place, it was gone. He had put his hands on my door. He knew which one was mine. Out of all the doors in this building, on this street, in this city, he knew. I sat there on the floor, clutching the wooden bird, for I don't know how long. An hour? 2? The logical part of my brain, small and screaming from a great distance, finally managed to get through. Police. Call the police. I crawled to my phone and dialed 911. My voice was a reedy, unfamiliar whisper. I tried to explain. A stalker. On my blog. In the fog. Now at my door. I left out the part about the bird in the photo. It sounded too crazy. I just said he left a strange object. 2 officers showed up 20 minutes later. They were professional, patient, but I could see the look in their eyes. The look they reserve for crazies and paranoids. I showed them the bird. I showed them the fog_watcher 79 inches comments on my phone. He leaves comments on your blog, and then he left this at your door? One of them asked, holding the bird in his gloved hand. Yes, but he's been following me for weeks. Out on the trails. I have proof, I stammered, my story sounding thin and disjointed even to my own ears. What kind of proof? A footprint, in the mud. And, he sent me a message. They took my statement. They were polite. They told me they would file a report. They asked if I had any idea who it could be. A disgruntled ex? A rival photographer? No, I whispered. I have no idea. They gave me a card with a case number on it. They told me to call if anything else happened. They told me to be careful, to make sure my doors and windows were locked. Then they left. I was alone again. Nothing had changed. If anything, it was worse. The tangible proof of the threat was now gone, taken away in an evidence bag, leaving me with only the suffocating certainty of it. I stood up, my legs weak, and walked back to the door. Driven by some morbid impulse, I put my eye to the peephole. The hallway was empty. The dim, yellow light cast long shadows from the other apartment doors. Nothing. I was about to turn away, a wave of profound despair washing over me, when I heard it. It wasn't a footstep. It wasn't a voice. It was the soft, oily click of a door latch catching in its frame. A neighbor's door, somewhere just down the hall. It hadn't been slammed or even closed firmly. It had been pulled shut, slowly and very, very quietly. The kind of quiet you use when you don't want anyone to know you've just come back inside. That click, it was so soft, I almost thought I'd imagined it. A tiny, oiled, metallic sound. The sound a person makes when they don't want to be heard. You know the sound I mean? It's not a slam, it's not even a firm close. It's the sound of stealth. The sound of someone who was just listening at their door, pulling it shut so carefully that the air barely stirs. I stayed frozen, my eye pressed to the peephole. The fisheye lens distorted the hallway into a sick, curved tunnel. Empty. I waited for a shadow to move, for another door to open, for anything. Nothing. Just the dim yellow light and the silence that was now louder than any noise. The silence was humming with the presence of the person who had just retreated behind one of those doors. Which one? 2B? Mrs. Gable, the sweet old lady with the yapping terrier? 2C? The 2 college students who were always either fighting or playing music too loud. Or 2A, the guy the first only ever saw in the laundry room, the one who never made eye contact. Suddenly, every harmless neighbor was a suspect. Every familiar face I'd nod to in the lobby was a mask. He was here, not out on some desolate cliff, not in the anonymous mist, but here, sharing a hallway with me, breathing the same recycled air. The police report felt like a joke, a piece of paper with a number on it, proof that I had complained, not that I was in danger. They had taken the bird. Now I had nothing but a story that sounded insane. I backed away from the door, my hands clammy. I was a prisoner, but the prison wasn't my apartment anymore. The prison was my own mind, and the warden was a man who lived just a few feet away. The next few days, or was it a week, I lost track, were a blur of suffocating stillness. I didn't leave. I couldn't. The thought of stepping into that hallway, of trying to guess which closing door held a monster behind it, was paralyzing. I ate the last of the canned soup, then a box of stale crackers. My world shrank to the view from my window. I watched people walk down the sunlit street, laughing, talking on their phones, living their lives. They had no idea. They existed in a world that was safe. I didn't live there anymore. The blog was silent. My camera sat in its bag, a dead weight of metal and glass. And the project, the faces of Carl, it felt like a lifetime ago. A naive, foolish dream from a man who thought the fog was just water vapor. Now I knew better. The fog wasn't a thing of beauty. It was a shroud. It was his hunting ground. And then, something shifted. It wasn't a brave decision. It wasn't a moment of heroic clarity. It was more like a fever breaking. I was sitting on my couch, staring at the dust motes dancing in a single shaft of light, and I realized something. He had already won. He had me locked in my own home, starving, terrified, talking to myself. I was waiting for the next note, the next wooden bird, the next quiet click of a door. The fear of waiting for the next blow became, somehow, worse than the fear of the blow itself. It was a slow, creeping rage that started in my gut. He had taken my art. He had taken my city. He had taken my home. He wasn't going to take the ending. I stood up. My legs were stiff. I walked over to my laptop and opened the map of my project locations. Twin Peaks, Mount Sutro, Land's End, Fort Funston, all of them crossed out in my mind. There was only one left. The grand finale I had been saving. The icon, the one place that represented San Francisco more than any other. The Golden Gate Bridge. If this was going to end, it would end there. It felt right, poetic, in a sick sort of way. I was going to finish my project. I wasn't going to let this faceless bastard take that from me. It was a stupid, reckless thought, born of desperation and cabin fever. But it was the only thought I had that felt like my own. It was a way to take back control, even if it meant walking right into the trap. I checked the forecast. Fog, dense fog, rolling in after midnight. Perfect. The hours before I left were methodical. I charged my camera batteries. I cleaned my lenses. I packed my bag with grim purpose. This wasn't the excited preparation of an artist. It was the cold ritual of a soldier getting his affairs in order. I wrote a short email to my sister. I told her I loved her. I told her that if anything happened to me, the police had a file number and a blog address. I put my laptop, the wooden bird report, and a printout of Fog_Watcher79's comments into a large envelope and left it on my kitchen table. Then I waited for the dark. Driving through the city was an ordeal. Every pair of headlights in my rearview mirror felt like him. Every dark-clothed pedestrian walking a dog made my heart hammer. The fog was already pouring over the hills, a silent, gray tide. It swallowed streetlights, turning them into hazy, jaundiced blurs. It was his element. I was walking onto his stage. I parked at the Visitors Plaza on the south side. It was late, close to 1 a.m., and the lot was almost empty. The air was thick and wet, tasting of salt and metal. I could hear the foghorns, a mournful, groaning duet across the bay. I zipped up my jacket, a pathetic defense against the damp chill that had nothing to do with the weather, hoisted my camera bag, and began the long walk out onto the bridge. There was almost no one. A lone cyclist in reflective gear whizzed past, disappearing into the mist. The sound of their tires on the pavement was eaten by the fog almost instantly. The bridge was a different world at this hour, suspended in a void. The massive, red-orange towers rose up into the gray nothingness above. The steady hum of the few cars passing on the roadway was a muted, distant drone. I walked about a quarter of the way out, to a spot I'd scouted weeks ago. It had the perfect view of the North Tower, its base disappearing into the swirling soup below. I set up my tripod, my hands clumsy with cold and adrenaline. Every sound was magnified, the creak of the tripod legs extending, the click of the camera mounting onto the plate, the whisper of my own jacket as I moved. I kept stopping, turning around, scanning the empty, fog-shrouded walkway behind me. Nothing, just the endless, empty stretch of concrete and steel fading into white. I tried to focus. I tried to be the photographer again. I peered through the viewfinder, composing the shot. The tower was a ghost, a monolith emerging from a sea of clouds. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. I adjusted the focus ring, my fingers tracing the cold, knurled rubber. I was looking at the LCD screen, checking the histogram, lost in the technical details for just a second. That was my mistake. I heard it before I felt it. A soft exhalation of breath. Right behind my neck. This last one will be our masterpiece, Alex. The voice was a low whisper. Calm, intimate, and absolutely devoid of any warmth. It was the voice of a snake. It knew my name. Time seemed to bend and stretch. My blood turned to ice water. Every survival instinct I had screamed, but I was frozen solid. Slowly, as if moving through tar, I turned my head. He was standing not 3 feet away. Tall, lean, dressed in dark gray, practical clothing that blended into the fog. A hood was pulled low over his head, casting his face in a deep, impenetrable shadow. I couldn't see his eyes, his mouth, nothing. He was just a shape, a human-shaped hole in the world. He raised one hand. In it, he held a camera. Not a modern DSLR like mine, but an old, vintage film camera. A relic. It was a gesture that was both a mockery and a strange sort of salute. Then, he raised his other hand. My breath hitched in my throat. The dim, orange glow of the bridge lights caught the steel. It was a hunting knife. A thick blade, at least 6 inches long, with a gut hook carved near the tip. The handle was well-worn wood. He held it loosely, casually, like it was an extension of his own arm. The camera in one hand, the knife in the other. The artist and the butcher. He took a small step closer. The fog swirled around his feet. "I've been watching you for a long time," he whispered, his voice still that same terrifyingly gentle monotone. "You have a good eye. But you only ever capture the landscape. You miss the most important part of the story. The human element." He gestured with the knife, a tiny, precise movement. "I just wanted a portrait of the artist, at the moment he creates his final work." That was it. The spell broke. The ice in my veins shattered and became pure, raw adrenaline. Sanity fled. There was no thought, no plan. There was only the primal, lizard brain need to live. My hands were still on my camera. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I reacted. I angled the camera up, pointing the lens directly at the dark space where his face should be. My thumb found the button. I jammed it down. Flash. A miniature sun exploded in the space between us. A silent, violent blast of pure white light. The man recoiled with a sharp, guttural hiss, his hands flying up to cover his face. He stumbled back a step. I could see the ghost of the flash, a bright blue rectangle, seared into my own vision. I didn't wait. The capacitor in the flash unit let out a high-pitched whine as it recharged. I hit the shutter again. Flash. Another blast. This time he cried out, a sound of fury and pain. "You." I didn't let him finish. I hit it again, and again. The whine of the capacitor was the only sound I could hear over the blood roaring in my ears. I was buying seconds. It was all I had. On the fourth flash, I saw my chance. He was disoriented, blinking furiously, one hand still over his eyes. His other hand, the one with the knife, had dropped to his side. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I just sprinted, my camera still clutched in my hand, banging against my chest. I ran blindly into the white nothingness of the fog, away from the towers, back toward the city. The concrete vibrated under my pounding feet. I chanced a single, terrified glance over my shoulder. The black shape was already recovering, straightening up, and then he was moving. I could hear him, heavy, angry footsteps on the pavement behind me, closing the distance far too quickly. And I could hear another sound, a thin, sharp sound, like a knife slicing through the thick, wet air as he ran. He was swinging it. He was coming for me. My lungs burned. It was a raw, tearing feeling, like I was inhaling fire and steel wool. The air was so thick with moisture it felt like I was trying to breathe underwater. Every greedy gasp was a failure. The only sounds were my own ragged breathing, the frantic, panicked drumming of my feet on the wet concrete, and the heavy, rhythmic thud of the camera against my ribs. It was a dead weight, a stupid, expensive anchor trying to drag me down. Behind me, I could hear his footsteps. They weren't frantic like mine. They were steady, powerful, the sound of a predator who knows its prey is already spent. I didn't know where I was going. There was no city, no shore, just an infinite white tunnel of fog, punctuated by the dim orange glow of the bridge lights above. They weren't comforting. They were like the lights in a morgue's hallway. I risked a look back, a stupid, classic horror movie mistake. He was closer than I thought. A dark silhouette gaining ground, an impossible shape moving through the mist. The knife wasn't in his hand anymore. That was somehow worse. It meant his hands were free to run faster. My mind was a blank slate of pure terror. There were no clever plans, no thoughts of fighting back. There was only the primal, animal command, run. My foot caught on something, a raised expansion joint in the pavement, maybe. It wasn't a dramatic stumble. It was clumsy and pathetic. My center of gravity shifted, my momentum betrayed me, and I went down. Hard. My hands scraped against the rough, non-slip surface of the walkway, and the impact sent a shockwave of pain up my arms. There was no time to get up. My body, still carrying the momentum of the run, tipped over the low concrete curb at the edge of the walkway. For a heart-stopping second, I thought I was going over the side of the bridge, into the black, churning water below. But instead of an endless fall, I hit soft, wet earth. I tumbled, graceless and uncontrolled, down a short, steep embankment of grass and mud that sloped down from the bridge's edge toward some maintenance area or anchor point. I landed in a heap at the bottom, my head ringing, the wet cold of the ground instantly seeping through my jeans. The camera, miraculously, was still slung around my neck, now caked in mud. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, gasping. A sick, coppery taste filled my mouth. Above me, on the edge of the walkway, his silhouette appeared. He stood there for a moment, a tall, dark figure against the hazy orange glow, looking down at me. He was perfectly still. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his gaze. It was the gaze of a man who had just cornered a rabbit. He put one foot over the curb, then the other, and began to walk, almost casually, down the slippery slope toward me. He raised his hand, and once again, the hunting knife materialized from the folds of his jacket. The dim light caught the blade, a single, cruel sliver of silver in the gray world. This is it. This is how it ends. The thought was strangely calm, a tiny, rational island in an ocean of panic. He was going to finish his portrait. He was maybe 10 feet away when it happened. A light, not the dim orange glow, but a brilliant, searing white light that cut through the fog like a laser beam. It hit him from the side, throwing his shadow, long and monstrous, across the slope and right over me. It was followed an instant later by a sound, a sudden, ugly, electronic yelp that escalated into a full-blown siren. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. He froze. His head snapped toward the source of the light. For the first time, I saw him display an emotion, surprise. He was a statue for a split second, caught in the unexpected glare of a spotlight. A voice crackled over a loudspeaker, garbled and distant, but unmistakably the voice of authority. In that moment, he wasn't a phantom from the mist anymore. He was just a man with a knife, caught in the headlights of a California highway patrol cruiser making a slow, routine pass across the bridge. And just like that, he was gone. He didn't run, not in the way I had. He turned, and with an agility that was terrifying, scrambled back up the short, steep slope. He vaulted over the concrete curb and onto the walkway. The police spotlight swung to follow him, but it was too late. He simply melted back into the fog. 1 second he was there, and the next, there was nothing but the thick, white shroud he came from. The next hour was a blur of flashing blue and red lights, crackling radios, and the methodical, detached questions of men in uniform. I told them everything. The blog, the comments from Fog_Watcher79, the wooden bird, the final, whispered threat on the bridge. I watched them write it all down on a clipboard. They listened, they nodded, they were professional. But I could see it in their eyes. The same look you give a man ranting on a street corner. A mixture of pity and professional obligation. A figure in the fog, one of them repeated back to me, his voice flat. With a vintage camera and a hunting knife. I knew how it sounded. It sounded insane. They took my statement. They had a K9 unit sniff around, but the fog was so dense, the dog just seemed confused. They found his footprints in the mud on the slope, confirming at least that I wasn't alone. But that was it. There was no knife, no camera, no suspect. Just a terrified, mud-stained photographer and a story that belonged in a cheap paperback novel. They gave me a ride back to my car, told me to call if I remembered anything else, and gave me a case number. A piece of paper with a number on it. Proof that something happened, but no promise of safety. The weeks that followed were strange. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel saved. I just felt quiet. The all-consuming terror had receded, leaving behind a low, humming anxiety that sat in the pit of my stomach. I stopped posting on the blog. I put my camera gear away in its bag and shoved it into the back of my closet. The project, The Faces of Carl, was dead. I couldn't even look at a picture of fog without feeling a cold sweat prickle my neck. I tried to live. I went to the grocery store. I did my laundry. I tried to convince myself that it was over. A freak encounter. A one-in-a-million brush with a madman. He had his chance. He was spooked. He was gone. He wouldn't be back. I repeated it to myself like a mantra, but I found myself double-checking the locks on my door at night. I flinched every time I saw a tall man in a hooded jacket. The city, my city, no longer felt like a home. It felt like a hunting ground where I had narrowly, accidentally, escaped the trap. Then, about 3 weeks after the incident, I got the call. It was a Detective Evans, the one assigned to my case. His voice was weary, the sound of a man buried in paperwork. "Mr. Ross, just calling to follow up on your report from the 23rd, he said, his tone all business. "Wanted to let you know the case is still open, but we don't have any strong leads on your assailant's identity." No similar MOS reported. Nothing. "Oh," I said, a familiar wave of disappointment washing over me. "Okay, I figured as much." But, he continued, and there was a slight shift in his tone, "we did manage to trace the online account. The Fog_Watcher79 profile." My heart gave a little kick. "You did? You found him?" "Not exactly. The guy was good. He routed his connection through a series of proxy servers all over Eastern Europe. Made it almost impossible to find a source. Almost. I could hear him shuffling some papers. We spent a lot of time on it. Most of the comments were sent from different IPs, different locations. A public library in the Mission, a Starbucks in the financial district, he moved around. But we found a pattern. The majority of them, especially the early ones, the ones that described your gear and your location in specific detail, they were all uploaded using the same Wi-Fi access point. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. Where was it? There was a pause. Detective Evans cleared his throat. It was the public Wi-Fi signal from a place called the Daily Grind Coffee Shop. On the corner of Larkin and Grove. The air left my lungs. My entire body went cold, a deep, cellular cold that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. I didn't have to look out my window. I knew exactly where Larkin and Grove was. It was directly beneath my feet. The Daily Grind was on the ground floor of my apartment building. "Mr. Ross?" the detective's voice said, sounding far away. "Are you still there?" I couldn't speak. My mind was reeling, trying to process the implication. The proxies, the different locations, they were a smokescreen, a clever bit of misdirection to make him seem like some random phantom out in the city. But his base, his nest, it was here. He sent them from my building, I finally whispered, my voice hoarse. "Seems that way," Evans said, his professional weariness returning. "He was likely a customer there, or maybe someone who lives nearby and just uses their signal. We checked with the staff, showed them a vague description. No one stands out. It's a busy place. Impossible to say for sure who it was." I stared at the wall of my apartment, the thin, flawed plaster that separated me from the rest of the world. Or so I had thought. "Thank you, detective," I managed to say. The words felt like ash in my mouth. "Thank you for letting me know." I hung up the phone without waiting for his reply. I stood in the middle of my living room, motionless. The silence was deafening. He hadn't just been following me in the fog. He had been watching me leave my apartment. He knew when I went out with my camera bag. He knew when I came home. He sat downstairs, sipping a coffee, typing his little observations into my blog, while I was just a few feet above his head, completely oblivious. The fog on Twin Peaks wasn't the hunting ground. This building was. I walked slowly to my front door and looked through the peephole. The distorted hallway stretched out before me, empty and silent. I thought of the neighbors I saw every day. Mrs. Gable in 2B with her yapping dog. The two college kids in 2C who were always fighting. The quiet man in 2A who I'd seen in the laundry room, the one who never made eye contact. Was it him? Was it the friendly guy in 3F who always held the elevator door? The young woman who jogged every morning? The fear I felt on the bridge was a sharp, clean thing. It was the fear of a knife, of a physical threat. This was something else. It was a suffocating, permanent horror. It was the realization that the monster wasn't a stranger hiding in the mist. The monster was a neighbor. He was still here, and every time I walked down the hall, every time I checked my mail, every time I heard a key turn in a nearby lock, I would be wondering which one of the familiar faces I nodded to was the one that belonged to the man who stood in the fog, holding a camera in one hand and a knife in the other.